Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to talk about some of the foundations of form modeling. Now, obviously on this channel, we've got a forms mastery playlist, and on our website, learneverythingaboutdesign.com, we have an absolute beginner's guide to freeform modeling, and we're going to be adding more advanced tutorials or courses on that website as well. But I get a lot of questions, even with all the content that we have, about some of the basics or some of the fundamental concepts that I've come up with over the years. So in this video, we're going to try to hit the top 4 or 5 general rules that I follow with pretty much all freeform designs. And we're going to start by laying out the rules, and then we'll dive deeper into each one. So the top 5 rules that I have when I'm dealing with freeform models is 1, the fewest number of faces possible for a design, and only add edges when and where you need them. So this is pretty important because the more faces we add, the more difficult it becomes to modify our design. The second is to stick to 4-sided faces if possible, and limit 3 or 5 plus-sided n-gons to areas of low curvature. And this is because tris or 3-sided faces are going to be essentially flat, and n-gons are going to have to fight for curvature and end up with deformations in the middle of those faces. The third is to limit coplanar faces and colinear edges to prevent wobbles in surface curvature. Now, of course, with every one of these rules, there are going to be exceptions where it works, or at least it's passable, but that's just a general rule, is if you can avoid it or help it, you want to sort of eliminate those colinear or coplanar sections. Number 4 is copy bodies to explore ideas for features and refinement. Freeform modeling is direct modeling, meaning we're not capturing history, we're not adding features to a timeline. So whenever you get to a point in your design where you want to start to add more detail, it's a good idea to just simply copy and paste that design. That way you have something that you can go back to. And number 5, understand the limits of forms and use surface and solid tools when needed. This is an important one, and it takes a lot of practice, but there are some general rules or guidelines that we're going to talk about in this video. So if you want to learn more about each of these, we'll leave a chapter list in the bottom of this video, so you can jump ahead to whichever one you want, but I'll try to keep this under 15 minutes if possible. So the first thing, the fewest number of faces. Now, this is important because when we're starting a design, we need to capture the geometry in a very general sense, and then we begin to add more edges or subdivide the design whenever we need to add more detail. So one way that I like to think about this is to first go back to a 2D sketch. And under a 2D sketch, if I create a spline using the control point option, if I make a single vertical line, one that's sort of at a 45 and a single horizontal line, this is a pretty good representation of a gradual curve. And this works exactly the same way as our freeform surfaces do. However, we have 4 or more of these edges dealing with or adding to the curvature. So we can think of each of these straight sections as an individual face on a freeform model. Now, the problem is if we start to add more and more and we try to create the same shape using multiple segments, while it might look very similar, there is a big nuance difference that happens. If I turn on the curvature combs for this one, we can see that we've got sort of a bump wave that happens in the middle. Now, this is actually pretty good for just freehanding it, but if we take a look at the one that only has 3 segments, this is a much better result because the transition from this vertical section to this horizontal section is much more gradual. The radius is larger on this bottom section and it's smaller on this top section. When we look at this one, it's larger on the bottom section and smaller on the top section. However, we get an increase and a decrease in that radius value as we go along the curve. Now, imagine that this is a freeform model and we actually have multiple curves in a different sort of patch or network, and we're using those to influence the curvature. So that's a big problem that we want to kind of address, and you can think about it in terms of 2D splines. So the fewer number of faces or edges that you can have to create your shape, the better off you'll be, not only for the quality of the surface, but also the ease of modification. If I needed to change this one here, it's very easy for me to get a larger radius in the middle and a smaller one at the start and end. However, this one, if I start to pull one section, then I have to go through and manipulate multiple sections, and if I'm lucky, I can get a good result. But you can even see here there's a little bit of a bump or a wobble. So this is kind of, again, reminiscent of how these features work. It's very difficult for you to get good quality curvature when you start to put too many divisions too early in your design. To take a look at this at sort of a sub D level, here we've got a very simple shape for a bumper. Now what I'm going to do is turn on the control cage display that shows the box on the outside and the smooth underneath. When we've got very small changes in curvature, the smooth display underneath and the control frame or box display on the outside are very close. However, when we start to get into areas of higher changes in curvature, we can see that they're very different. And that's because the influence happens from this side and from this side over here. And it's going to dictate what happens on this face in the middle. Keeping this to the lowest number of faces possible to achieve that general shape is going to be very important. The second thing that we want to talk about is the fact that when we go to make modifications to this design, it's going to be much easier in this low sort of polygonal state. Keep in mind that it's a good idea to get comfortable with modeling in box display. This is going to be much easier to make sure that your curvature is going to be high quality because you can instantly see if you've got a potential problem. If we're dealing with something in smooth display and I begin moving an edge out, for example, it may not be instantly apparent that I'm creating a wobble or an issue in the middle there. But when we start to look at this in box display, it may become more apparent because of the way that we've moved things. So I'm going to use Control Z to go back and put it back where it was. But let's talk about modifications when we're using the fewest number of faces. So in a design like this, if I wanted to, say, pull or bulge out the bottom of this section, a couple ways that we can do this are by inserting edges in the areas we want, or we can actually reduce the number of faces now and add them back later. So for example, I can double click this bottom edge and delete it. Then I can double click this edge, use modify. And in this case, what I want to do is hold down Alt so I can start to extrude. And then I want to scale this outward. Now you can see that it's scaling outward left to right pretty well, but the front is not. So I'm going to let go of Alt, and I'm going to scale it forward a little bit, which is going to extend it out. Next thing I want to do is rotate this around. And once again, I'm going to hold down Alt and pull this downward. And then once again, I'm going to rotate this around to a top view, and I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to scale this inward. And now if I go over to my smooth display, I was able to create that bump or that lip. Now again, we want to keep it to the lowest number of polygons possible because it makes the modifications and changes much easier. In box display, if I wanted to pull this front section out, I could double click the upper and lower edges, use modify, go to my top view, and I could start to scale this forward to extend it out, and I can even move the entire thing forward if needed. Once again, if we go back to our smooth display, we can see what we did and make those changes. Now, again, modifications are going to be tricky and it's going to be very dependent on your specific model. But now that we've added a couple of extra faces and edges, we can do things like add a bevel to help control the curvature a little bit better, maybe tighten this up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and add a bevel here as well. And then if we need to make any additional changes, we can always, once again, double click edges, use edit form, and maybe pull these down to get it to taper a little bit more. If we want a tighter transition here, once again, we can insert edges or use bevel edge, and we can start to add those details slowly and surely. Now, once again, it's important to note that having a low polygon version of this is going to be much easier to go back and change or add details to, because once we've added all these edges, it becomes very difficult for us to make big changes to the overall shape. All right, so the next thing that we want to talk about is going to be using 4 sides versus 3 or 5. Now, this is another important one, and I'm going to do this again by taking a look at the splines that we have. When we're talking about 2D curves, I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that one. When we're talking about 2D curves, again, we can assume that this is a freeform model, and each of these straight sections is going to be our box display. But this, again, is just in 2D. When we move this into 3D, each of these straight sections represents an edge, and there's going to be curvature coming into and out of those edges. Because of this, the 4-sided patch or the 4-sided face mathematically speaking, is going to have the best chance at creating that NURB surface underneath, that non-uniform rational B-spline surface. Because at the core or heart of all of our CAD design, we need to understand that math is at play in terms of calculating the shapes that we're trying to create. And this is why creating these shapes with surfaces requires us to create curves. For example, a loft is going to need profiles and guide curves to create these similar or same types of shapes. So when we move from 2D, such as the spline, into 3D, we have to start to think about the layout of these designs. In most cases, you can stick with 4 sides for a majority of a design. However, whenever we decide to change direction, so for example, on a fender or a fender flare, whenever we have to go around a wheel arch, we're going to run into what's called a star point, and we're going to run into triangles or n-gons, things that have more than 4 sides. There are a couple of things that we can do to remedy these situations, but at the basic level, we want to make sure that we put these triangular or n-gon faces away from any drastic changes in curvature. So for this design here, what I could do is go to Modify and Insert Point, and I can break up this bottom edge of this triangle. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to turn that triangle into a quad. Let's go ahead and zoom back in. We'll move it and pull this down a little bit. So now what we have is 4 sides. And if we look at this in smooth display, the transition is very gradual. We still have this star point, which is problematic because we are changing directions from essentially going down this way to going left to right. But as long as we can stick that star point further away from any drastic changes in curvature, it's going to be okay in our design. Another thing to highlight this is going to be this fender that we did. We had a series where we kind of modified or reverse engineered this Fiat fender from a race car. Now, this is a great situation where, again, we've got this transition from going left to right, and we've got to go up around the wheel arch. This introduces these n-gons, which have more than 4 sides. So you can see this one has 5, and on this side, it has 5 as well. Now, these are generally going to be okay, but we need to make sure that they're in areas, again, of low changes in curvature. So you can see that this n-gon was placed 1 face away from a change in curvature. Now, this is going to be an intentional thing that you'll have to do on your designs to try to move these away from those changes in curvature. And the big reason for this simply comes down to the fact that when we've got multiple edges, more than 4 in this case, all fighting for curvature to determine what happens to this face on the inside, if all of the surrounding faces are close to flat, that means not much is going to happen on the inside of this fender. We can see over here, there is a slight divot or wrinkle. And if I turn on my curvature map analysis and I start to crank this up a little bit, we should be able to start to see that show up on the curvature map analysis. Because of this transition here in the surrounding faces, we can see that we're starting to get a crease or a divot that happens in the middle of that face. Now, again, this isn't always a bad thing, and looking at a curvature map analysis, cranking this all the way up doesn't necessarily mean that you have a bad surface, but it does help us identify these areas where we may potentially start to have a problem. Now, this n-gon here doesn't have that same problem as this one, and if we back up and we take a look at this in box display, it's because this one is likely going to have a little bit more change in curvature between this face and this face. We can see here that there's a larger angle. And if we go back to this one, the angle between these 2 faces is a little bit smaller. So anytime we've got these n-gons or these star points or even these triangles, we want to try to stick them in areas of low changes in curvature as opposed to sticking them near features that have high changes in curvature. The next thing that we want to talk about is to limit faces or edges that are coplanar or collinear. Now, the main reason for this is because when we have areas that are coplanar, in this case, we've got this box that was created and we've got a lot of sections on top that are flat. We have to remember that the curvature is dictated by these edges, but also the surrounding faces. If we just had a single face, it would be completely flat. So it's taking into account the tangency direction and the radius of curvature of the surfaces next to it on all sides. So what this means is that when we've got a design like this that has a lot of internal edges, we can think about getting rid of them by inserting an edge in the middle, for example, going to Insert Edge, And then we can get rid of the edges on either side. So this limits the number of faces that are coplanar in this design by reducing the need for those additional edges. It's not going to have a drastic change in the overall shape or curvature of the design. And in most cases, when you're getting away from these basic prismatic shapes, staying away from these straight sections, these coplanar regions or collinear edges, is going to ensure that you've got nice gradual transitions or changes in curvature away from these broader flat surfaces and into the more curvy or sections where you've got larger changes in curvature. If you're dealing with a design that is more complex, so let's say this fender flare here, generally what we would see is edges like this, if we look at it from the top, are going to be essentially collinear, which means that this line and this line are going in the same direction. And all we really want to do is make sure that the angle between those is not exactly 180 degrees. So there is no real good way for us to measure that. It's very much a visual process, but we want to be able to play around with the location of these vertices in order to make sure that we're trying to avoid those collinear edges and coplanar regions. Again, this is a general rule. There are situations where you may break that rule and it would be fine. But as just a general rule, when you're talking about complex designs, we want to look for these gradual changes in angles between edges and avoid collinear and coplanar regions. The next thing that we want to talk about is copying bodies. So if you're working on a freeform design, it's good practice when you get to that initial low for sort of face count or low polygon state is to just simply select it and do Control C, Control V, or do a right click copy and paste. Because this is direct modeling, we don't have any history associated with any changes. So if you want to make a drastic change to a design, then having a copy of the original of a shape that you like, maybe it fits perfect with some other design, and then you can begin to make changes. And in this case, for example, we could start to flare out the side here, and then maybe we could bring the front out and just make some minor changes to a version of it. And then we can go back and forth and play with different variations and see which one works better for our design. But then we've always got that original sort of basic shape down. So this copy and paste functionality is extremely handy, and it's something that I use all the time when I'm using freeform designs. The other option is actually to turn history off. If you toggle off history, then what's actually going to happen is the freeform models and any surfaces or solids will exist at the same time. So what this means is anytime you want to turn a freeform model into a surface model, you have to manually go and convert from T-spline to B-rep. And then you can even do things like pick specific edges that you want to keep in a design. You can say, okay, then you can convert it to a surface. In this case, it's got several that were converted. But you can see here we were able to keep that edge, which lets us do things like create offset surfaces pretty easily. So there are definitely some benefits to using direct modeling approach, either with or without history, but copying a basic design once you have the shape down, it can be really helpful. And the last thing that we want to mention is understanding the limits of freeform modeling. So one of the biggest questions that I get, or when I see freeform models from users, is trying to do too much, either have too many edges, too many faces, or just try to put too many complex details in a design. Now, this Fiat fender is kind of pushing the limit of what we should do. So, for example, incorporating the opening for the headlight, it's probably not the best idea because the geometry would be better and more consistent if we did it as a surface feature after the fact. So in reality, what I would do is likely make a surface or a face with freeform models for the headlight bucket, and then we could use that to trim away and blend things together. Another thing that you'll note is consistent edge treatment. So if you need a fillet, for example, having a consistent radius on a corner is something that you would want to do after the fact instead of trying to do it here. And there are other areas of this. So for this Starion fender here, so for example, I've got overlapping faces with the mesh. And the reason for this is because making a triangular section here that perfectly fits on the car and wraps around is probably going to be very difficult. So the way that I would generally approach this is I would create the model that sits over the part and then recreate the geometry of this section. And then I could use those to trim each other away. So I know that my new part fits perfectly, and I can also not worry about trying to tweak and change the overall shape of my design here, because in reality, having this face here rather than a triangle is going to help preserve curvature at that back edge. Whereas if we make a triangle, then we're potentially going to introduce some problems in the shape. So there are going to be limits to designs, and generally what I would say is things like air duct openings, if they can go with the flow of the freeform model, then you can incorporate them. But keep in mind that things like a consistent radius on a corner are going to be much easier to do as a surface after the fact than trying to do those inside of the freeform model. So you can make use of this. We've done a video in the Fusion Forms Mastery series about overbuilding and trimming back. That's certainly an option. And again, making multiple freeform surfaces as different parts of the design, like the headlight bucket on the Fiat, this could be a way to get a nice consistent surface here. Now, of course, you can try to incorporate everything into a freeform model, but again, we start to introduce these things like star points and n-gons, either triangles or 5 or more sided faces. And once you start to do that, you run the risk of getting inconsistent surface geometry. So depending on the end goal, if it's a 3D print, probably never notice. If you're trying to manufacture something with CNC machining or injection molding, then those are things that you want to be very careful with about how you go constructing these designs. And it's also important to note, while we're understanding the limits, that forms is almost never the entire model. In probably 50% or more designs, the freeform is only going to be a quarter to a half of the design. So for example, if I spend an hour or two getting a freeform model ready for, let's say, a plastic molded part, I may spend 50 to 200 hours on all the other details of that part, whereas the freeform portion of it was just an hour or two at the start of the design. So it helps create those initial complex shapes, but all the little detail work, features that you add downstream, those happen with traditional tools like surface or solid tools. So keep in mind that freeform modeling is not very often the entire model, that you will have to work with other tools like surface tools in order to complete a design. So at the end of the day, these are just 5 of the basic rules that I use whenever I'm doing a freeform model. Again, using the fewest number of faces possible for a design, only add edges or different face divisions when you need them. Stick to 4-sided faces whenever possible. If you need to do 3 or 5 sides, try to place them away from changes in curvature. If you have a design that has a bunch of coplanar or collinear edges, coplanar faces, try to reduce that as much as possible and add a small angle between them. This will help ensure that you have consistent change in curvature rather than having some potential dimples or divots that happen in your surface. Use copy bodies to explore shapes. That way you've got an original low face count version of the design that you can go back to at any point in time. And understand the limits of forms. Know that forms generally isn't going to be the entire design process. You will need to use solid or surface tools to make sure that you can complete the design for manufacture, whether that's 3D printing, CNC machining, whether it's injection molding or some other form of manufacture. You will likely be using additional tools after the fact. Now, if you have any questions on this topic or anything else, please leave a comment below. If you like this content, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're looking for anything specific, let me know in the comments below. We do have video courses for sale on learneverythingaboutdesign.com, where we go over the basics of part design, assemblies, surfacing sheet metal, freeform, and we're adding more advanced courses. We've got PCB design, complex surface design, and so on. So if you're looking for additional content, make sure that you do check out our website. I'll leave links in the description of this video. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.